Deep in the Montana wilderness, mountain man Caleb Stone thought he'd left his past buried 20 years ago. Living alone in a cabin miles from civilization, he'd made peace with solitude until a small voice broke through the forest silence. The lost boy, no more than 6, emerged from the pines with tears streaming down his dirt-stained face. When Caleb knelt to comfort the child, those innocent words shattered his carefully constructed world. "She loves you, my mama told me about you every night." The boy's eyes held a familiar warmth that stopped Caleb's heart cold. This child belonged to Sarah, the woman who'd walked away from their love to marry another man. Now that same woman needed his help, and this little boy might be the son he never knew he had. But what devastating truth had driven Sarah to send her child alone into the dangerous wilderness to find him? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Caleb Stone had built his cabin 7 miles from the nearest trail, where the Montana wilderness stretched unbroken toward the Canadian border. For 20 years, this remote sanctuary had sheltered him from the world and its painful memories. The rough-hewn logs bore the marks of his own hands, every beam and board placed with the careful precision of a man who had nowhere else to go. The morning had begun like any other. Coffee brewed over the stone hearth, bacon sizzling in the cast-iron pan his mother had given him before he left civilization behind. Through the single window he watched the sun paint the mountain peaks in shades of gold and crimson, a daily masterpiece that never failed to remind him why he'd chosen solitude over society. But now everything had changed. The boy sat at his rough wooden table, small hands wrapped around a cup of warm milk, his tear-streaked face studying Caleb with an intensity that made the mountain man's chest tight with recognition. Those eyes, green as summer grass with flecks of gold, belonged to Sarah McKenna, or Sarah whatever her name was now after 20 years of marriage to another man. "What's your name, son?" Caleb asked, settling into the chair across from the child. "Tommy," the boy whispered. Then louder, "Tommy Henley. But Mama says my real name should be Stone, like yours." The words hit Caleb like a physical blow. Henley. He knew that name, though he'd tried to forget it. Robert Henley owned the largest ranch in the territory, a man whose wealth came from cattle and whose power came from ruthlessness. The same man who'd married Sarah just months after she'd walked away from their love. Tommy reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something that made Caleb's breath catch. A pressed wildflower, its delicate purple petals preserved between thin sheets of glass, the same kind Sarah used to collect during their long walks through mountain meadows. She'd called them forget-me-nots, laughing at the romantic foolishness of the name, while pressing them into books like promises she intended to keep. "Mama gave me this," Tommy said, placing the flower on the table between them. "She said you'd remember when you saw it. She said you picked these for her when you were young." Caleb's hands trembled as he touched the glass. The flower looked exactly as fresh as those summer days 20 years ago when he'd gathered wildflower bouquets for Sarah, believing their love could overcome anything the world threw at them. He'd been wrong about many things, but he'd never forgotten the joy in Sarah's face when he'd present her with these simple mountain treasures. "Tell me about your mama," Caleb said, his voice rough with emotion he'd thought buried forever. Tommy's face lit up with the innocent love only a child can feel for his mother. "She's beautiful and she smells like bread and flowers. She tells me stories every night before bed, and lots of them are about you, about how you lived in the mountains like a king in a castle, and how you could track any animal and build anything with your hands." The boy's words painted a picture that both warmed and wounded Caleb's heart. Sarah had kept his memory alive for her son, had turned their lost love into bedtime stories that made him sound heroic rather than heartbroken. But why? If she'd chosen Robert Henley over him, why fill the boy's head with tales of the man she'd left behind? "She cries sometimes when she tells the stories," Tommy continued, unaware of the emotional storm his innocent observations were creating. "She says you were the best man she ever knew, but that sometimes good men have to go away to keep the people they love safe." Caleb pushed back from the table, unable to sit still under the weight of these revelations. Through the window he could see storm clouds gathering over the distant peaks, matching the turmoil in his heart. Sarah had married Robert Henley, borne his child, or was Tommy truly Caleb's son, and spent 20 years telling their boy stories that kept Caleb's memory alive. But none of that explained why Tommy was here, alone in the wilderness, carrying a pressed flower and words that suggested Sarah still loved the man she'd abandoned 2 decades ago. "Tommy," Caleb said carefully, "why did your mama send you to find me? What happened that made her think I could help?" The boy's face crumpled with fresh tears, and when he spoke, his words carried the weight of adult fears no child should have to bear. "Because Miss Prophet her had done. And this time she said she was gonna die if somebody didn't come save us." The old military compass had been Caleb's constant companion since his army days, its brass face worn smooth by countless fingers seeking direction in hostile territory. Now it pointed steadily northeast as he and Tommy made their way down the mountain trail, the instrument's steady needle the only certainty in a world that had turned upside down in the span of a morning. Tommy walked beside him with the determined gait of a child who'd already traveled farther than most adults would attempt. His small legs worked to match Caleb's longer stride, and though he never complained, Caleb could see exhaustion creeping into the boy's movements. They'd been walking for 3 hours, descending through pine forests that smelled of resin and earth, following game trails that would eventually lead to the valley settlements. "Tell me more about these stories your mama told you," Caleb said, adjusting his pack and keeping his voice casual despite the urgency gnawing at his chest. Tommy's face brightened despite his fatigue. "She said you built her a swing once, hung it from the biggest tree in Miller's Grove. She said you pushed her so high she felt like she was flying, and that she was never scared because she knew you'd catch her if she fell." The memory hit Caleb with unexpected force. He could still see Sarah's face, radiant with laughter as the rope swing carried her toward the sky, her long auburn hair streaming behind her like a banner of joy. He'd been 23 then, full of plans for their future together, believing love could conquer the practical concerns that seemed so small compared to what they felt for each other. "She said you carved animals too," Tommy continued, his small hand reaching up to touch Caleb's arm. "Horses and deer and bears, so real they looked like they might walk right off the shelf. She kept them all, even after you went away." Caleb's throat tightened. He'd spent countless evenings whittling by firelight, creating a menagerie of wooden creatures for Sarah's collection. She displayed them proudly on the mantelpiece of her father's house, arranging and rearranging them like tiny sentries guarding their love. The thought that she'd kept them through 20 years of marriage to another man suggested feelings he'd assumed were long dead. They paused at a creek crossing, the water running clear and cold from mountain springs. Tommy knelt to drink, cupping his hands with the natural instincts of a child raised close to the land. Caleb watched him, noting the boy's comfort with wilderness that most town children would find frightening. "Tommy, how did you know where to find me? The mountains are vast, and my cabin isn't marked on any map." The boy wiped water from his chin and looked up with those familiar green eyes. "Mama drew me a picture. She said she used to walk those trails with you, and she remembered every turn and landmark. She made me practice the route until I could recite it like a poem." The implications of Sarah's detailed knowledge struck Caleb like a physical blow. She'd retained not just memories of their time together, but precise geographical information about his refuge. That suggested she'd thought about finding him more than once over the years, perhaps even planned routes that could bring her back to the man she'd left behind. As they resumed walking, Caleb found himself studying Tommy with new eyes. The boy's hair was dark brown like his own, though with Sarah's natural wave. His hands, though small, showed the long fingers that ran in Caleb's family. Most telling were his movements, the way he navigated rough terrain, the instinctive manner in which he tested each foothold before committing his weight. "Tommy, what does Mr. Robert look like?" Caleb asked, dreading the answer, but needing to understand the enemy they were walking toward. The boy's expression darkened immediately. "He's big and loud, with yellow hair and mean eyes. He smells like whiskey and leather, and when he gets angry, Mama makes me hide in the root cellar until he stops shouting. Does he hurt you too? Tommy's steps faltered, and for a moment, Caleb thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. He says I'm not his real son, that I'm just something Mama brought into his house that he has to feed and clothe out of charity. He says if I ever tell anyone our business, he'll send me away where Mama can never find me. Caleb's hands clenched into fists at his sides. The compass needle trembled in his palm, pointing toward a confrontation that was becoming more inevitable with each revelation. Whatever had happened between him and Sarah 20 years ago, whatever misunderstandings had driven them apart, none of that mattered now. This child needed protection, and Sarah needed rescue from a situation that had clearly become desperate. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks, when men finally saw smoke rising from the valley settlement below. The general store in Pine Valley hadn't changed much in 20 years. Caleb stood in the doorway, Tommy's small hand gripping his own, while familiar faces turned to stare at the mountain hermit they'd written off as dead or disappeared. Behind the counter, Martha Grayson's mouth fell open in recognition, her weathered hands clutching the bolt of calico she'd been measuring. Caleb Stone, she breathed, her voice carrying the weight of 2 decades worth of unanswered questions. Lord have mercy, we thought you were gone for good. Other customers began to murmur among themselves, the kind of urgent whispers that would spread through the settlement faster than wildfire. Caleb had forgotten how small communities devoured news, especially news involving people who'd once been the subject of considerable speculation and gossip. Mrs. Grayson, Caleb nodded respectfully, his free hand resting protectively on Tommy's shoulder. We need supplies for the road, and maybe some information about the Henley spread. The older woman's eyes shifted to Tommy, and Caleb watched recognition dawn across her features like sunrise breaking over mountains. She'd known Sarah since the girl was Tommy's age, had probably sold her penny candy and fabric for her wedding dress. Those keen eyes took in the boy's familiar features with the practiced assessment of someone who'd watched 3 generations of Valley families grow and change. This would be Tommy Henley, Martha said carefully, her voice neutral but her eyes sharp with understanding. Sarah's boy. Yes, ma'am, Tommy replied politely, though he pressed closer to Caleb's side when the attention focused on him. From his jacket pocket, Caleb pulled out a torn photograph he'd discovered in his cabin that morning, half of an old picture showing him and Sarah together at the church social, their young faces bright with hope and love. He'd kept it all these years, unable to throw it away completely, but unable to bear seeing Sarah's face whole. Now, looking at it again, he realized someone had deliberately torn it in half, separating their images as cleanly as fate had separated their lives. I reckon you know why I'm here, Caleb said quietly, placing the photograph on the counter where Martha could see it. The older woman's expression softened with something that might have been pity or understanding. She glanced around the store, noting the other customers who were pretending to shop while straining to hear every word of the conversation. Robert Henley's got a powerful hold on this valley, Martha said, her voice low enough that only Caleb and Tommy could hear. He's got men, money, and the sheriff in his pocket. Sarah's been having a hard time of it, especially since Tommy was born. The implication in her words hit Caleb like a physical blow. Martha was old enough to count months and years, smart enough to recognize features that repeated themselves across generations. If she suspected what Caleb was beginning to believe about Tommy's parentage, others would too. How hard a time, Caleb asked. Martha's weathered hands began folding the calico with unnecessary precision. Her eyes focused on the fabric rather than meeting his gaze. The kind of hard time that leaves marks, if you understand my meaning. The kind that makes a woman send her precious boy into the wilderness alone, hoping someone will come help before it's too late. A younger man approached the counter, someone Caleb didn't recognize but whose bearing suggested authority. He wore a deputy's badge and carried himself with the swagger of someone who enjoyed the power that came with enforcing other people's will. Caleb Stone, the deputy said, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. I'm Deputy Walsh. Mr. Henley's been expecting you. The words sent ice through Caleb's veins. If Robert Henley knew he was coming, That meant Sarah's desperate plan had been discovered, which meant she was in even more danger than Tommy had indicated. Has he now? Caleb replied evenly, though his grip on Tommy's hand tightened protectively. He surely has, said his stepson. Ran off yesterday morning, and he figured the boy might head up into the mountains, looking for old stories his mama filled his head with. Mr. Henley's been real worried about the child's safety. The lie was delivered with the smooth confidence of someone who'd practiced it. But Caleb could see the truth in Martha Grayson's eyes. She began wrapping their supplies with quick, efficient movements, her face carefully neutral but her hands trembling slightly, with suppressed emotion. "Tommy's safe with me," Caleb said. "I'll make sure he gets home to his mother." Deputy Walsh smiled, but the expression held no warmth. "Mr. Henley figured you might see it that way. He's asked me to escort you both to the ranch. Make sure there's no misunderstanding about the boy's welfare." The trap was closing around them, and Caleb realized that Sarah's desperate gamble had been anticipated by the man who controlled her life. The Henley Ranch sprawled across the valley floor like a small kingdom, its buildings arranged with the calculated precision of a man who understood that appearance projected power. The main house rose 3 stories into the Montana sky, its white columns and wraparound porches speaking of wealth imported from somewhere far more civilized than the frontier. Around it, barns and outbuildings stretched toward the horizon, all painted the same pristine white that required constant maintenance and demonstrated Robert Henley's ability to afford such luxury. Deputy Walsh rode beside their wagon with the casual confidence of a man escorting prisoners rather than protecting citizens. Caleb kept Tommy close, noting how the boy seemed to shrink smaller with each mile that brought them closer to what he clearly considered enemy territory. The child's earlier excitement at their adventure had been replaced by the tense silence of someone approaching a place where pain lived. As they crested the final hill overlooking the ranch, Caleb saw her. Sarah stood on the front porch like a queen surveying her domain. But even from a distance he could see that 20 years had carved changes into the woman he'd once loved with the desperate intensity of youth. Her auburn hair had deepened to rich mahogany, pulled back in the severe style expected of a ranch owner's wife. Her dress was fine enough to grace a drawing room in Denver, but it couldn't hide the stiffness in her posture that spoke of a woman who'd learned to hold herself ready for whatever blow might come. The moment she spotted Tommy in the wagon, her careful composure crumbled. She flew down the porch steps with a mother's desperate love, her skirts billowing behind her as she ran toward them with no regard for dignity or appearance. When she reached the wagon, she pulled Tommy into her arms with such fierce protectiveness that Caleb felt his throat tighten with emotion. "My baby," she whispered into Tommy's hair, her voice thick with tears she'd probably been holding back since he disappeared. "My precious baby, I thought I'd lost you forever." Over Tommy's head, her eyes met Caleb's, and 20 years collapsed into nothing. She was older, yes, with fine lines around her eyes that spoke of worry and tears he hadn't been there to dry. But those eyes, green as mountain meadows in spring, held the same warmth that had haunted his dreams for 2 decades. "Hello, Sarah," he said softly, climbing down from the wagon with movements that felt clumsy under the weight of her attention. Caleb, his name on her lips, sounded like a prayer and a question wrapped together. Her free hand fluttered toward her throat, where he could see the pale gold band of her wedding ring catching the afternoon sunlight like a tiny shackle. The moment of reunion was shattered by the sound of boots on the porch. Robert Henley emerged from the house with the deliberate stride of a man claiming territory. He was everything Tommy had described, and worse. A large man whose presence seemed to consume space around him, his blonde hair going grey at the temples, and his pale eyes cold as winter sky. His clothes were expensive but practical, the uniform of a man who wanted everyone to know he could afford the best while still being capable of violence if the situation required it. "Stone," he said, the single word carrying more menace than a longer threat might have managed. "I wondered when you'd finally show your face again." Sarah's arms tightened around Tommy, and Caleb noticed how she instinctively stepped backward, putting more distance between herself and her husband. The movement was so subtle that someone who didn't know her might have missed it, but Caleb had once known every gesture and expression that crossed her face. "Henley," Caleb replied, matching the other man's tone with careful neutrality. "Your boy got lost in the mountain. I brought him home safe." Robert's laugh held no humor, the sound harsh as winter wind through bare branches. "My boy, is that what you think he is?" His gaze shifted to Tommy with something that made the child press closer to his mother's side. "Interesting theory, considering the timing of his birth and certain physical resemblances I've noticed over the years." The words hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, charged with implications that made Sarah's face go pale. Caleb felt his hands clench into fists at his sides, every instinct screaming at him to put himself between this man and the woman who'd once been everything to him. "Tommy's a good boy," Caleb said carefully, "regardless of who his father might be." "Oh, I think we all know who his father is," Robert replied, his smile cold as a blade. "The question is what we're going to do about it now that you've decided to complicate our peaceful family life." The branding iron hung on the barn wall like a declaration of ownership, its H-shaped brand dark with soot and use. Robert Henley had led them inside with the casual confidence of a man showing off his domain, but Caleb understood the real mess. Everything in this barn, the horses, the cattle, the land itself, belonged to Robert Henley, marked permanently with his symbol of possession. "You see, Stone," Robert said, running his fingers along the iron's handle, "everything on this ranch bears my mark, my cattle, my horses, my buildings." His pale eyes shifted to Sarah, who stood protectively beside Tommy near the barn door. "My wife." The threat in his voice was unmistakable. Sarah's hand found Tommy's shoulder, her knuckles white where she gripped the boy's shirt. Caleb noticed how she positioned herself between her son and her husband, a barrier of maternal protection that spoke of long practice in recognizing danger. "I never came here looking for trouble," Caleb said, keeping his voice level despite the rage building in his chest. "The boy was lost. I brought him home. That's the end of it." Robert laughed, the sound echoing off the barn's high rafters where dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the open doors. "The end of it? You think 20 years of questions just disappear because you want them to?" He picked up the branding iron, testing its weight in his hands like a weapon. Behind him, 3 ranch hands had gathered, hard men whose loyalty was bought with steady wages and the kind of work that didn't ask too many questions about methods. Caleb recognized the type from his army days, men who followed orders without considering consequences. "Tommy," Robert called, his voice deceptively gentle. "Come here, boy." Tommy shrank against his mother's side, his earlier courage evaporating in the face of the man who'd terrorized him for 6 years. Sarah's arm circled her son protectively, her chin lifting with defiance that reminded Caleb of the spirited girl he'd fallen in love with decades ago. "Leave him alone, Robert," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "He's done nothing wrong." "Nothing wrong?" Robert's voice rose, the veneer of civility cracking to reveal the anger beneath. "He runs off in the middle of the night, scares his mother half to death, brings a stranger to my property, and you say he's done nothing wrong?" The ranch hands shifted closer, reading the tension in their employer's voice and preparing for whatever orders might come. Caleb calculated distances and odds, his old military training assessing threats and escape routes. 3 armed men plus Robert, 1 woman and child to protect, 60 yards to the nearest cover. "The boy was scared," Caleb said, taking a step forward that put him between Robert and his family. "Children run when they're frightened. Maybe the question is what he was running from." Robert's face flushed red above his collar, the branding iron raising slightly in his grip.
"Are you questioning how I run my household, Stone?"
"Because that sounds like a man who doesn't understand his place in this situation." "My place?" Caleb felt his own temper stirring, 20 years of mountain solitude, making him forget the careful diplomacy required when dealing with men like Robert Henley. My place is protecting innocent people from bullies who think money and hired guns make them untouchable. The barn erupted into motion. Robert swung the branding iron in a vicious arc that would have crushed Caleb's skull if he hadn't ducked at the last second. The ranch hands moved forward with practiced coordination, hands reaching for weapons, while Sarah screamed and pulled Tommy toward the door. Caleb caught Robert's wrist on the backswing, his mountain-hardened strength surprising the larger man. They grappled for control of the iron weapon while the ranch hands circled, looking for a clear shot that wouldn't endanger their employer. "Run," Caleb shouted to Sarah. "Take Tommy and run." But even as he fought, Caleb knew they were trapped. Deputy Walsh appeared in the doorway, blocking their escape route with a drawn pistol and a satisfied smile. Sarah's desperate flight was cut short by the lawman's presence, leaving her clutching Tommy against the barn wall with nowhere to go. "That's enough," Walsh commanded, his weapon trained on Caleb. "Let go of Mr. Henley and step back, Stone. You're under arrest for assault and trespassing." Robert wrenched the branding iron free, breathing hard from the struggle, his expensive shirt torn and dusty from the fight. His pale eyes burned with humiliation and rage as he straightened his clothes with shaking hands. "You made a mistake coming here," he told Caleb, his voice deadly quiet. "But don't worry, I'll make sure you have plenty of time in jail to regret it." The silver locket had belonged to Sarah's mother, Eleanor McKenna, who'd worn it every day until consumption claimed her when Sarah was 16. Now Sarah clutched it against her throat as she stood at Caleb's jail cell window, the moonlight casting shadows across her tear-stained face. The town jail sat behind the sheriff's office, isolated enough that their whispered conversation wouldn't wake the deputy sleeping at his desk 20 yards away. "I never meant for this to happen," she breathed, her fingers working at the locket's delicate clasp. "When I sent Tommy to find you, I thought maybe you could take him somewhere safe, away from all this." Caleb pressed his face against the iron bars, drinking in her presence after 20 years of emptiness. This close, he could see the faint bruises along her jawline that she'd tried to hide with powder, the way she favored her left arm, as if it pained her to lift it. Evidence of Robert's discipline that made his hands shake with suppressed rage. "Sarah, why did you marry him?" The question had tortured him for 2 decades, but he'd never had the courage to ask, until now. Her laugh was bitter as winter wind. "You left, Caleb. You disappeared without a word, and my father owed Robert money from a bad cattle deal. Robert said he'd forgive the debt if I married him, and father was dying. I thought you didn't want me anymore." "Left?" Caleb's voice cracked with disbelief. "Sarah, I never left. I came to your father's house that morning like we planned, to ask for your hand proper. Your father said you'd gone to Denver, that you'd decided mountain life wasn't refined enough for a woman of your education." The locket slipped from Sarah's fingers, swinging on its chain like a pendulum marking lost time. Her face went white in the moonlight, understanding dawning with terrible clarity. "Father told me you'd taken work in California," she whispered. "Said you'd left a message that you were sorry, but you couldn't be tied down to a wife and children when there was fortune to be made out west. I waited 3 months for you to come back or send word, and when Robert started pressing his suit, Father said it was my duty to tarry for the family's sake." 20 years of misunderstanding collapsed between them like a bridge with rotten pilings. Both had been lied to, manipulated by a dying man's desperation and a rich man's desire. Sarah's father had sold his daughter's happiness to save his ranch, and Robert had been willing to pay that price for a beautiful wife who would bear his name if not his love. "Tommy's yours," Sarah said suddenly, the words tumbling out as if a dam had burst inside her. "I knew it the moment he was born. Robert knew too, but by then it was too late for him to back out of the marriage without losing face. He's hated us both ever since." The locket opened with a soft click, revealing not the expected miniature portrait, but a folded piece of paper so small it seemed impossible it could contain words. Sarah's hands shook as she unfolded it, revealing her mother's careful script in faded ink. "Mama wrote this before she died," Sarah explained, holding the paper close to the window bars so Caleb could read it. She said to give it to the man I truly loved when I was ready to fight for happiness instead of just accepting whatever life handed me. The note was brief but clear. My darling daughter, love is not a luxury for people like us. It is a necessity. Without it, we become shadows of who we were meant to be. Fight for love, always, even when the world tells you to be practical. Especially then. Your devoted mother, Eleanor McKenna. She knew, Sarah whispered. Mama knew what kind of man Robert was, what kind of life I'd have with him. But I was 18 and scared and thought I was protecting you by staying away. I thought if Robert believed Tommy was his, you'd be safe from his jealousy. Caleb's fingers found hers through the bars, their hands touching for the first time in 20 years. Her skin was softer than he remembered, but marked with small scars he didn't recognize, evidence of the hard life she'd endured while he nursed his wounded pride in mountain solitude. We have to get Tommy away from here, he said urgently. Robert's planning something worse than jail for me, and when I'm gone, he'll take his anger out on both of you. Sarah's grip on his fingers tightened. There's a key to my hope chest, hidden in the root cellar. Inside are papers, money I've been saving for 6 years, waiting for the courage to run. Tomorrow night when Robert's in town for his weekly poker game. Tomorrow might be too late, Caleb warned. The church bell had summoned Pine Valley's faithful for Sunday services for 37 years, its bronze voice carrying across the mountain valley with the same steady devotion that had once called Caleb and Sarah to their weekly courtship. Now, as Deputy Walsh escorted Caleb toward the modest white building, that same bell seemed to toll with the weight of broken promises and lost dreams. Reverend Morrison had aged like oak in the 20 years since Caleb last saw him, his hair silver white, but his back still straight with the conviction of a man who'd wrestled with God and emerged with his faith intact. He waited on the church steps, his weathered Bible clutched in hands that had blessed marriages and buried the dead through decades of frontier life. Caleb Stone, the Reverend said, his voice carrying the same gentle authority that had guided Caleb through the confusion of youth. I wondered if you'd ever find your way back to us. The church interior smelled of pine oil and old hymn books. Unchanged from Caleb's memories of sitting beside Sarah in the third pew, her hand resting secretly in his while they pretended to pay attention to sermons about love and forgiveness. Deputy Walsh removed Caleb's shackles at the Reverend's insistence, then took a seat near the door with his hand resting on his pistol. You wanted to see me, Reverend? Caleb asked, settling into the familiar wooden pew that creaked under his weight exactly as it had 2 decades ago. Morrison opened his Bible to a page marked with a pressed wildflower, the same purple forget-me-not that had once grown wild in Miller's Grove, where Caleb had built Sarah's swing. The sight of it made his chest tight with memory and loss. Sarah asked me to speak with you, the Reverend said, his fingers tracing the delicate petals with the reverence of someone who understood their significance. She thought you should know the truth about what happened all those years ago, from someone who was there to witness. Deputy Walsh shifted restlessly in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with this delay in whatever Robert Henley had planned for his prisoner. But even corrupt lawmen respected the sanctuary of churches, and Morrison's reputation for honesty made him dangerous to antagonize without cause. Your father-in-law, Samuel McKenna, came to see me 3 days before Sarah's wedding, Morrison continued. He was dying, consumption eating him from the inside, and he needed to confess his sins before facing judgment. He told me how Robert Henley had threatened to foreclose on the McKenna ranch unless Samuel could find a way to pay his debts immediately. The Reverend's voice carried the weight of secrets kept too long, words that had festered in his conscience for 20 years, while 2 people who loved each other lived in separate hells of their own making. Samuel was desperate. His ranch was all he had to leave Sarah, the only inheritance that could provide for her future. When Robert offered to forgive the debt in exchange for Sarah's hand, Samuel saw it as God's providence. But the lies? Caleb asked, his voice rough with emotion. Why tell us both that the other had abandoned our love? Morrison closed the Bible gently, the pressed flower disappearing between pages of scripture about love and redemption. because he knew neither of you would willingly sacrifice your happiness for money. Sarah would have chosen poverty with you over wealth with Robert, and you would have found a way to pay Samuel's debts, even if it meant working yourself to death in the mines. The truth hit Caleb like a physical blow. Samuel McKenna had loved his daughter enough to break her heart, believing that a comfortable life with a rich man was better than a struggle with a poor one. He'd never imagined that Robert's wealth came with a cruelty that would make Sarah's life a daily torment. He regretted it before the end, Morrison added. Sent word asking you both to come see him, but Robert intercepted the messages. By the time I realized what was happening, Samuel was dead, and Sarah was married to a man who saw her as property he'd purchased, rather than a woman he'd won. Through the church window, Caleb could see the cemetery where simple wooden crosses marked the graves of people who'd lived and died in this valley. Sarah's father lay among them, his secret carried to the grave, while the consequences of his choice poisoned 2 decades of his daughter's life. There's something else, Morrison said, reaching into his coat pocket. Sarah wanted you to have this. He produced a small wooden horse carved from mountain pine, with the careful attention to detail that marked Caleb's handiwork. The toy bore the scratches and wear of being treasured by small hands, evidence of hours spent in play and comfort. Tommy's favorite, the Reverend explained. Sarah told him it was carved by his real father, a man who lived in the mountains like a king in a fairy tale. Storm clouds gathered over the valley with the ominous weight of divine judgment, their dark bellies pregnant with rain that would turn the dusty roads into rivers of mud. From his jail cell window, Caleb watched lightning fork across the sky, while thunder rolled through the mountains like God's own artillery, each rumble seeming to echo the turmoil in his heart. The weather matched his mood as reports filtered back from the ranch through Deputy Walsh's casual cruelty. Robert had discovered Sarah's midnight visit to the jail, and his rage had been swift and terrible. The hired hands spoke in hushed tones about screaming that carried across the ranch yard, about Tommy hiding in the storm cellar, while his mother paid the price for her defiance. She should have known better than to go sneaking around in the dark, Walsh said, settling into his chair with the satisfied air of a man delivering news he knew would cause pain. Miss Henley don't appreciate his wife conducting business behind his back, especially with men who got no business being here in the first place. Caleb's hands gripped the iron bars until his knuckles went white, the metal cold against his palms like the steel of the guns he'd carried in the war. Violence sang in his blood, the old soldier's instinct to protect what mattered most. Warring with the practical knowledge that breaking out of jail would only make things worse for Sarah and Tommy. But practicality was losing the battle against paternal fury. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, fat and heavy as tears on the dusty street. The storm was building towards something biblical, the kind of weather that changed landscapes and washed away the sins of the past. In the distance, Caleb could see riders approaching through the gathering gloom. Robert Henley and his men, their horses' hooves throwing up clouds of dust that the rain would soon turn to mud. Looks like your host is coming to pay a visit, Walsh observed, checking his pocket watch with theatrical precision. Right on time, too. Mr. Henley's always been punctual about important business. The riders pulled up in front of the jail with military precision, their leader dismounting with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to command. Robert Henley had changed into traveling clothes, dark pants and coat that would hide bloodstains, boots suitable for rough work, the kind of outfit a man wore when he planned to get dirty doing something he didn't want to be remembered for. Evening, Deputy Robert called, his voice carrying easily through the storm's growing intensity. I trust our guest has been comfortable as circumstances allow, Walsh replied, moving to unlock the jail's outer door. Been asking a lot of questions about his family situation, though. Seems mighty concerned about things that ain't his business. Robert entered the jail building with the confident stride of a man entering his own domain. Behind him came 3 of his most trusted hands, men whose loyalty was bought with gold and sealed with shared secrets about the darker aspects of ranch management. The kind of men who could make problems disappear in ways that wouldn't raise questions from distant authorities. Stone, Robert said, stopping just outside Caleb's cell with his hands clasped behind his back like a general reviewing troops. I hope you've used your time here for reflection, considered the wisdom of staying out of other people's business. I've been thinking, Caleb replied carefully, reading the danger in the other man's pale eyes, mostly about how a man who claims to love his wife shows that love by terrorizing her and the boy she's trying to protect. Robert's smile was cold as winter moonlight. Love? You think this is about love? This is about property, Stone, about respecting boundaries and understanding consequences. Things you never learned, apparently. The storm outside reached a crescendo, rain lashing against the jail's windows while thunder shook the building's frame. Through the chaos, Caleb could hear something else, the sound of horses and voices approaching from a different direction. More riders, moving fast despite the weather. You see, Robert continued, seemingly oblivious to the approaching sounds, Sarah made a mistake tonight. She thought she could defy me, carry on secret conversations with my property's unwelcome guests. She needed to be reminded of her place in the natural order of things. The jail door burst open, admitting a figure that made everyone in the room freeze with shock. Sarah stood dripping in the doorway, her dress torn and muddy from hard riding, a shotgun cradled in her arms with the easy familiarity of someone who knew how to use it. Behind her, Tommy peered around his mother's skirts, with wide eyes that reflected the lightning flickering outside. The only mistake I made, Sarah said, her voice carrying the deadly calm of a woman who had finally reached the end of her patience, was waiting 20 years to do this. Caleb's hunting rifle had taken more game than he could count over 20 years of mountain living, its worn wooden stock smooth from countless hours of patient stalking through pine forests and rocky canyons. Now it spoke with deadly authority as he and Sarah fought their way through the storm-lashed valley, their pursuers' shouts growing closer with each crack of thunder that split the night sky. Sarah rode like a woman possessed, her hair streaming behind her as she urged her stolen horse through terrain that would challenge seasoned cowboys in daylight, let alone in the fury of a mountain storm. Tommy clung to her waist with the desperate grip of childhood terror, his small face pressed against her back to shield himself from the driving rain. Behind them, Robert's men spread out in a practiced pattern, their talons bobbing through the darkness like evil stars as they tried to cut off escape routes to the high country. Deputy Walsh's voice carried over the storm, shouting orders that revealed their strategy: drive the fugitives toward the canyon where the trail narrowed to a single path with nowhere to run. There's a cave system about 2 miles ahead, Caleb called to Sarah, having to shout to be heard over the wind. We can lose them in the rocks if we can reach it before they corner us in the open. Sarah nodded, her jaw set with the determined expression he remembered from their youth, when she'd decided to prove she could climb the same trees and ford the same creeks as any boy in the valley. That stubborn courage had attracted him 20 years ago, and now it might be the only thing that could save their lives. A rifle shot cracked through the storm, the bullet whining off a boulder 20 yards to their left. Robert's men were close enough to take shots, even if the weather made accuracy nearly impossible. Caleb wheeled his horse around, bringing the rifle to his shoulder, with movements made automatic by years of hunting and old military training. A lantern light gave him a target, and his shot was rewarded by a cry of pain and the crash of a rider hitting the muddy ground. One down, but too many still coming, and Tommy's terrified sobs reminded him that this wasn't just about his own survival anymore. They reached the canyon entrance as lightning illuminated the towering walls of stone that rose on either side like the gates of some ancient fortress. The narrow trail wound upward through gaps barely wide enough for a single horse, treacherous in good weather and potentially deadly in the storm. But it was their only chance to reach the high caves where pursuit would be impossible on horseback. "Sarah, take Tommy and keep climbing," Caleb ordered, dismounting and slapping his horse's rump to send it running loose. "I'll hold them here as long as I can." "No," Sarah replied fiercely, her own rifle appearing from her saddle scabbard. "We stay together. I won't lose you again. Not to Robert, not to anyone." Tommy slid from the horse with the fluid grace of a child raised around animals, his small hands already reaching for the rocks that would provide handholds on the steep climb ahead. Even terrified, he moved with the sure instincts of Caleb's bloodline, reading the terrain like a natural-born mountaineer. The first of Robert's men appeared at the canyon mouth, their horses snorting and dancing as they tried to navigate the rocky approach. Deputy Walsh rode in the lead, his badge gleaming wetly in the lightning flashes, his pistol drawn despite the impossibility of accurate shooting in such conditions. "Stone," he bellowed, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "You're only making this worse for yourself and the woman. Surrender now, and maybe Mr. Henley will show mercy." Caleb's answer came in the form of a rifle shot that shattered the lantern in Walsh's hand, plunging the deputies into darkness and sending their horses rearing in panic. The narrow canyon amplified the sound into thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountains. "The only mercy we need is what we make for ourselves," Caleb called back, already moving to a new position among the rocks, while Sarah and Tommy began their climb toward safety. But even as they climbed, more lights appeared in the valley below. Robert had summoned every man on his payroll, and they were spreading out to cover every possible escape route from the canyon system. The hunt was far from over, and dawn would bring clear skies that would make hiding impossible. In his heart, Caleb knew they had perhaps 6 hours before the mountains that had sheltered him for 20 years became a trap, with no way out. The hidden room behind Caleb's cabin had been carved from living rock during his first winter in the mountains. A sanctuary within a sanctuary that even the most determined searchers wouldn't discover without tearing the entire structure apart. Sarah ran her fingers along the smooth stone walls, marveling at the patient craftsmanship that had created this secret space where her heart could finally stop guarding itself against the world's cruelties. Tommy had fallen asleep within minutes of reaching safety, his small body finally surrendering to exhaustion after 2 days of terror and adventure beyond his young imagination. He lay curled on Caleb's spare blankets, one hand still clutching the wooden horse his father had carved, his face peaceful in sleep despite the storm that continued to rage outside their mountain refuge. "I used to dream about this place," Sarah whispered, settling beside Caleb on the simple wooden bench he'd built along one wall. "Not this room specifically, but somewhere safe, where we could just be together without the world demanding explanations or justifications." Caleb's arm found its way around her shoulders, with the natural ease of a gesture remembered by muscle and bone, even after 20 years of separation. She fit against his side exactly as she always had, as if the decades had been nothing more than a long, painful dream from which they were finally awakening. "I built it thinking about you," he admitted, his voice rough with emotions he'd kept buried for too long. "Every stone I moved, every beam I placed, I imagined you here with me, safe from whatever storms might come. Foolish, maybe, but it kept me going through the loneliest nights." Sarah turned in his arms, studying his face in the flickering candlelight that cast dancing shadows across the stone walls. Age had marked him with lines around his eyes and silver in his dark hair, but underneath she could still see the young man who'd once promised to love her until the mountains crumbled to dust. "Papa?" Tommy's sleepy voice interrupted the moment, his green eyes blinking owlishly in the dim light as he struggled to orient himself in this strange underground chamber. The word he'd spoken, "Papa," hung in the air like a blessing, the first time he'd called Caleb by that sacred title without prompting or explanation. "I'm here, son," Caleb replied, his throat tight with the wonder of it. 20 years of wondering what it would feel like to have a child call him father, and now he knew it was like having his heart grow too large for his chest. Tommy sat up, rubbing sleep from his eyes with small fists that reminded Caleb powerfully of his own childhood gestures. "Are the bad men still coming?" "They can't find us here," Sarah assured him, moving to gather their son into her arms. "This is Papa's secret place, and we're safe as long as we stay hidden." But even as she spoke the words, they could hear sounds filtering down from above. Boots on the cabin floor, voices raised in frustration as Robert's men searched for any sign of their quarry. The storm had passed, leaving crystal-clear skies that would make further flight impossible without careful planning. "They'll search all day and into tomorrow," Caleb said quietly, his mind already working through possibilities and contingencies. Robert won't give up easily, not when his pride is at stake along with everything else. Sarah's hand found his, their fingers intertwining with the desperate intensity of people who'd lost each other once and couldn't bear the thought of separation again. In the candlelight, her wedding ring caught the flame's reflection, the golden band that had symbolized 20 years of captivity now seeming fragile as eggshell. "I have money hidden away," she said, her voice barely above a whisper so Tommy couldn't hear. "Enough to get us somewhere far from Robert's reach, maybe California or Oregon territory. We could start over, be a real family." The dream she painted was everything Caleb had wanted for 2 decades, but practical concerns weighed heavy on his heart. Robert Henley had resources that reached far beyond the Montana territory, connections that could make wanted posters appear in every town from here to the Pacific Ocean. "We'll need more than money," he said carefully, not wanting to crush her hope, but unable to ignore the reality of their situation. "We'll need to disappear completely, become different people with different names. Can you do that, Sarah? Leave everything behind and trust me to keep you safe?" Her answer came not in words, but in the way she leaned into him, her body speaking the trust that 20 years of separation had tested but never broken. Above them, angry voices gradually faded as the search moved away from the cabin, but they all knew this was only temporary respite. The real test would come with daylight, when Robert's manhunt began in earnest. Sarah's diary lay open on the rough wooden table like a confessional seeking absolution, its pages yellowed with age and stained with tears that had fallen during 20 years of secret writing. The leather binding bore the scars of being hidden and retrieved countless times, tucked away in places where Robert would never think to look for evidence of his wife's inner rebellion against the life he'd forced upon her. Caleb read with growing amazement and heartbreak, Sarah's careful script revealing a woman who'd never stopped loving the man she'd lost, who'd recorded every memory of their time together like a scholar preserving sacred texts. Entry after entry chronicled her longing, her regrets, her desperate hope that somehow their story wasn't finished. June 15, 1883. Today would have been our 10th wedding anniversary if Father hadn't lied to us both. I told Tommy the story of the swing again, how his real papa built it from the strongest rope and hung it from the tallest tree so I could touch the sky. He asks why Papa had to go away, and I tell him that sometimes good men have to live in the mountains like kings in castles, protecting the land until the day comes when they're needed most. October 3, 1887. Robert struck me again today. Said I was much too independent in my thinking. I hid in the root cellar afterward and counted the money I've been saving, $27 now. Not enough to ton, not yet, but enough to dream. Tommy looks more like Caleb every day. Those same green eyes that see everything, the same way of tilting his head when he's thinking. Robert sees it too, and I fear what he might do when his patience finally breaks. December 25, 1889. Christmas morning, and Robert gave me a new dress, expensive silk from Denver. I thanked him properly, played the grateful wife, but all I could think about was the Christmas Caleb and I spent in Miller's Grove. Nothing but wildflowers and promises between us. Tommy asked if Santa might bring his real papa back someday. I told him to keep believing in miracles. Tommy stirred in his sleep, unconsciously reaching for his mother's hand as if her distress could penetrate his dreams. Sarah stroked his hair with infinite gentleness, her touch carrying all the protective love of a woman who'd sacrificed everything to keep her child safe from a man's jealous rage. I wrote every day, she whispered to Caleb, her voice thick with the weight of accumulated secrets. Every memory I had of you, every hope I carried, every prayer I whispered in the darkness, when Robert's snoring finally assured me he was asleep. I was terrified he'd find it, but I was more terrified of forgetting. Caleb turned the pages with reverent care, each entry a window into the parallel life Sarah had lived in her imagination while enduring the reality of her marriage. She documented Tommy's growth with the precision of a naturalist, noting every gesture and expression that revealed his true parentage. April 12, 1892. Tommy carved his first whistle today, his small hands holding the knife exactly as I remember. Caleb holding his tools, the concentration on his face, the patience with the wood, the way he tested each cut before making the next. It's like watching his father work through a looking glass of time. He has the gift, Caleb's gift, for making beautiful things from nothing but patience and love. August 30, 1894. Tommy asked me today why Mr. Robert doesn't love him like other fathers love their sons. How do I explain to a 6-year-old that some men's hearts are too small for love, too poisoned by jealousy and pride? I told him his real papa loves him so much that it fills up all the empty spaces, that love like that never dies even when the person seems far away. The final entries grew increasingly desperate as Robert's abuse escalated and his suspicions about Tommy's parentage hardened into dangerous certainty. Sarah had begun making concrete plans for escape, mapping routes through the mountains, hiding supplies in places where they could be quickly retrieved. May 15, 1896. Robert knows. I can see it in his eyes when he looks at Tommy, the calculation behind his anger. He's planning something terrible. I can feel it in the way he watches us both. Time is running out. Tomorrow I'll tell Tommy the story of the Mountain King one last time. But this time it won't be just a story. This time I'll give him the map I've drawn and pray that his papa's love can reach across 20 years of silence to save us both. The diary's final entry was dated just 3 days ago, written in a hand that shook with fear and determination in equal measure. Sarah's last words before sending Tommy into the wilderness were a prayer and a promise that brought tears to Caleb's eyes as he read them aloud. Whatever happens to me, my darling boy will know his father's love. And maybe, if God is merciful, that love will be strong enough to bring us all home. The bear trap lay half buried in the leaves outside Caleb's cabin, its steel jaws gleaming with the cold precision of a predator's bite. Robert Henley had positioned it with the calculated cruelty of a man who understood that the most effective weapons were those that turned a victim's own movements against them. One careless step and those serrated teeth would snap shut with enough force to shatter bone, leaving their target helpless and screaming for whatever mercy Robert chose to dispense. Caleb discovered it when he emerged from the hidden room at dawn, his hunter's instincts warning him that something was wrong with the familiar landscape around his sanctuary. The metal gleamed unnaturally among the forest debris, too geometric and clean to belong in nature's random patterns. Behind it, he could see the disturbed earth where other traps had been placed, creating a maze of potential agony around every approach to the cabin. "Clever bastard," Caleb murmured, studying the trap's mechanism with the professional appreciation of one predator recognizing another's skill. Robert had learned something about mountain warfare during his years of controlling the valley, understanding that in Caleb's territory, patience and preparation mattered more than numbers and firepower. Through the trees, movement caught his eye. Robert's men were taking positions in a careful perimeter around the cabin, their rifles trained on windows and doorways while they waited for their quarry to emerge. But something was wrong with their formation, a hesitation in their movements that suggested uncertainty about their orders. From his hidden vantage point, Caleb could see Robert himself standing in the clearing below, his expensive clothes replaced by the practical garb of a man preparing for violent work. In his hands he held a rope that made Caleb's blood run cold with recognition. A hangman's noose, already knotted and ready for use. "Stone," Robert's voice carried easily through the morning air, pitched to reach the cabin whether its occupants were inside or hiding nearby. "I know you're listening, so let's discuss terms like civilized men." Caleb remained silent, counting positions and calculating odds while his mind raced through possibilities. Sarah and Tommy were safe in the hidden room, but that safety would last only as long as Robert remained ignorant of the chamber's existence. "You see this rope?" Robert continued, holding the noose high enough for anyone watching to see its grim purpose. "I brought it special for you, Stone. Figured a man who's lived wild in the mountains for 20 years deserves a frontier kind of justice." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, but Robert wasn't finished with his performance. He gestured to one of his men, who dragged a struggling figure into the clearing. Margaret Howell, Caleb's elderly neighbor, her hands bound behind her back and fear bright in her weathered eyes. "Now, I know you're thinking this is between you and me," Robert called out, his voice carrying the satisfied tone of a man playing a winning hand. But Mrs. Howell here made the mistake of asking too many questions about why armed men were searching her neighbor's property. Seems she's got some misguided notion about protecting folks from what she calls unjust persecution. Caleb's hands clenched into fists as he watched the old woman struggle against her bonds. Margaret had been nothing but kind to him over the years, bringing food during harsh winters, and respecting his solitude while making sure he knew he wasn't completely alone in the world. Now she was paying the price for simple human decency. "Here's my offer," Robert continued, the noose swinging gently in his grip. "You come out peaceful-like, hands empty and ready to discuss this situation like reasonable men. In exchange, Mrs. Howell goes home to her cats and her garden. No harm done. But if you make me wait much longer..." Well, he didn't need to finish the threat. The rope spoke eloquently about what would happen to Margaret if Caleb didn't surrender, and they both knew that Robert was capable of carrying out his promise with the same cold efficiency he applied to all his business dealings. From the cabin behind him, Caleb heard the faint sound of movement. Sarah emerging from the hidden room, probably drawn by the voices and desperate to understand what new danger threatened their fragile safety. He turned to motion her back to hiding, but it was too late. Through the cabin window he saw her face appear for just an instant, pale with fear but bright with determination. Robert's sharp eyes caught the movement immediately, and his smile transformed into something predatory and triumphant. "Well, well," Robert called out, his voice rich with satisfaction. "Looks like we've got ourselves a family reunion after all." The Henley family Bible was bound in black leather that had absorbed 20 years of Robert's sweat and anger, its pages marked with passages about dominion and submission that he'd twisted into justification for every cruelty he'd inflicted in the name of righteousness. Now it lay open on a tree stump like an altar of perverted justice, while Robert stood over his captives with the fervor of a preacher, delivering damnation to the wicked. Caleb knelt in the dirt with his hands bound behind his back, his shoulders straining against rope that bit into his wrists with every movement. Beside him, Sarah maintained her dignity despite her terror, her chin lifted in defiance that reminded him of the spirited girl who'd once climbed trees to prove she was afraid of nothing. Margaret Howell sat tied to a nearby pine, her elderly frame trembling but her eyes bright with the kind of courage that came from having lived long enough to recognize true evil when she saw it. Tommy stood pressed against his mother's side, his small hands clutching her torn skirt while his green eyes darted between the adults with the desperate confusion of a child trying to understand why the grown-ups were playing such a frightening game. Robert had positioned the boy where he could see everything, a calculated cruelty that revealed his understanding of how to inflict maximum psychological damage. "You see, gentlemen," Robert addressed his men as if conducting a business meeting, his finger tracing biblical verses about the punishment of adulterers and thieves. "Scripture is quite clear about the consequences of coveting another man's property. Stone here has violated the most sacred bonds of marriage and family, corrupted a godly woman with his lustful influence." Deputy Walsh nodded along with practiced sycophancy, though some of the other men shifted uncomfortably at Robert's theatrical righteousness. These were hard men accustomed to violence, but most retained enough humanity to feel uneasy about threatening women and children in the name of holy justice. "The boy, of course, is innocent of his parents' sins," Robert continued, his pale eyes fixing on Tommy with an expression that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. "Scripture teaches us that the sins of the fathers shall be visited upon the sons, but I'm a merciful man. I'm prepared to raise the child as my own, teach him proper values and respect for authority." "Like hell you will," Caleb snarled, straining against his bonds with such fury that the ropes began to cut into his flesh. The thought of Tommy growing up under Robert's twisted influence, learning to see cruelty as strength and fear as respect, was more unbearable than any physical torture. Robert's backhand caught Caleb across the face with enough force to split his lip and send stars dancing across his vision. But even as his head rang from the blow, Caleb saw something that gave him hope, Several of Robert's men were exchanging glances, their expressions suggesting they were having second thoughts about their employer's methods. "You will speak when spoken to," Robert commanded, his voice carrying the cold authority he'd used to dominate Sarah for 20 years. "Your time for making demands ended when you decided to steal another man's wife and child." Sarah's voice cut through the mountain air like a blade, clear and strong despite her fear. "Tommy was never yours, Robert. He was conceived in love, not bought with debt and threats. You know it, I know it, and God knows it." The truth hung in the clearing like smoke from a signal fire, impossible to ignore or dispel. Robert's face flushed red above his collar, the careful control he prided himself on beginning to crack under the pressure of public humiliation. His men were watching now, waiting to see how their leader would respond to such open defiance from the woman he'd claimed to own. "Blasphemy," Robert hissed, raising his hand as if to strike Sarah. But Tommy surprised everyone by stepping forward, his small body shielding his mother with the instinctive bravery of innocence protecting love. "Don't hurt my mama," the boy said, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying enough determination to stop Robert's hand in midair. "She never did anything bad. She just loves Papa, and Papa loves us." The simple words from a child's mouth carried more power than any sermon, cutting through Robert's biblical justifications to reveal the ugly truth underneath. This wasn't about righteousness or justice, it was about a petty man's wounded pride, his inability to accept that money couldn't buy the kind of love that had created the boy standing before him. For a moment, something almost human flickered in Robert's pale eyes as he looked down at Tommy. Then it was gone, replaced by the cold calculation of a man who'd decided that if he couldn't have what he wanted, he'd make sure no one else could either. Caleb's military medal lay in the dirt beside his fallen body, its bronze surface catching the morning sunlight like a fallen star. The Congressional Medal of Honor had been awarded for valor during the Indian Wars when Sergeant Caleb Stone had single-handedly held a mountain pass against overwhelming odds to save his wounded comrade. Now it bore witness to another kind of battle, one fought not for country but for family, not for glory but for love. Robert Henley stood over his defeated enemy with the satisfied expression of a man who believed he'd finally proven his superiority over the ghost that had haunted his marriage for 20 years. The fight had been brief but vicious, ending when Deputy Walsh struck Caleb from behind with his pistol butt, while the mountain man grappled with Robert's superior numbers. "You always were too proud for your own good, Stone," Robert said, nudging the unconscious man with his boot. "Thought living in the mountains made you some kind of noble savage, didn't you? But you're just another drifter who couldn't provide for a woman the way a real man can." Sarah struggled against the ropes that bound her to the pine tree, her eyes blazing with fury as she watched blood seep from the gash in Caleb's scalp. "You coward," she spat, her voice carrying the accumulated rage of 20 years of oppression. "You needed 5 men and a sneak attack to beat one man who was protecting his family. What kind of victory is that?" Robert's face darkened at her words, the careful mask of righteousness slipping to reveal the petty tyrant underneath. He'd expected Sarah to break down, to beg for mercy and promise submission if he'd spare Caleb's life. Instead, she met his cruelty with defiance that reminded him of everything he'd never been able to possess, despite all his wealth and power. Tommy knelt beside his fallen father, his small hands touching the medal with reverent curiosity. "What's this, Papa?" he whispered, though Caleb couldn't hear him through his unconsciousness. Margaret Howell, still bound to her tree but forgotten in the drama of the confrontation, spoke up with the clear voice of moral authority. "That's a Medal of Honor, child. They give those to heroes, men who risk everything to protect innocent people from evil." Her words carried across the clearing like a challenge, and several of Robert's men shifted uncomfortably. They'd signed on to work cattle and intimidate competitors, not to participate in the torture of medal-wearing war veterans and their family. The medal in the dirt made Caleb's sacrifice tangible, transforming him from a romantic rival into something approaching a saint. "Shut up, old woman," Deputy Walsh snarled, but his voice lacked conviction. Even corrupt lawmen understood the symbolic power of military decorations, the way they connected individual actions to larger concepts of duty and honor. Robert sensed the change in his men's mood and knew he needed to act quickly before their doubts undermined his authority. He pulled his pistol with theatrical flourish, pointing it directly at Caleb's head, while Tommy scrambled backward with a cry of terror. "This ends now," Robert declared, his finger tightening on the trigger. 20 years of questions, 20 years of wondering, 20 years of living with another man's shadow in my house. I should have done this the day Sarah married me. But as Robert spoke, none of them noticed that Caleb's eyes had opened, consciousness returning with the crystal clarity that sometimes follows head injuries. The medal lay within reach of his bound hands, its ribbon still strong despite years of storage. Moving with the deliberate patience of a hunter, he began working the ribbon's edge against the ropes that held his wrists. "You're making a mistake, Robert," Sarah said, her voice carrying a note of warning that made him pause. "There are witnesses here, people who remember what they saw. Kill Caleb, and you'll never be safe from the consequences." Robert's laugh was harsh as winter wind. "Witnesses? You mean my employees and a hysterical woman grieving her lover's tragic accident? Who's going to believe their word against mine?" But even as he spoke, other voices began to echo through the forest riders approaching at speed, their calls carrying the authority of legitimate law enforcement. Reverend Morrison's voice rose above the others, shouting Caleb's name with the urgency of a man bringing salvation to the desperate. The cavalry had arrived, but whether they were coming as rescuers or executioners remained to be seen. Robert's grip on his pistol tightened as he realized his careful plan was unraveling, that the isolation he'd counted on to hide his crimes was about to be shattered by the arrival of witnesses he couldn't control or corrupt. Behind him, unnoticed in the chaos, Caleb's hands finally worked free of their bonds. Tommy's first carved animal sat in his small palm like a promise made flesh, its wooden curves rough from amateur hands, but unmistakably alive with the spirit its creator had breathed into simple pie. The rabbit's ears stood alert, its body poised for flight, captured in the moment between stillness and movement that marked the difference between mere craftsmanship and true artistry. The dust of the confrontation had settled both literally and figuratively, leaving the mountain clearing strewn with the debris of Robert Henley's shattered empire. Deputy Walsh sat slumped against a tree, with his hands cuffed behind his back, his badge torn from his shirt and lying in the dirt like a discarded promise. The other ranch hands had scattered when the real law arrived, unwilling to face federal charges for kidnapping and conspiracy. Robert himself lay unconscious in the back of a wagon, his face bearing the marks of Caleb's fists, and his future bearing the weight of witness testimony that no amount of money could silence. Reverend Morrison had brought not just the territorial marshal, but 3 respected ranchers who'd grown tired of Robert's stranglehold on valley commerce and were eager to see justice finally served. "He's got the gift," Caleb said softly, watching Tommy's small knife follow the wood's grain with instinctive understanding. "Your hands know what the wood wants to become before your mind does. That's something you can't teach, son. It's something you're born with." Sarah sat beside them on a fallen log, her torn dress and bruised face testament to the morning's violence, but her eyes bright with the joy of watching her 2 favorite people discover each other. The sight of Caleb teaching their son the ancient art of wood carving filled a hollow space in her heart that 20 years of loneliness had carved out. "Mama used to tell me stories about the animals Papa made," Tommy said, his concentration absolute as he worked the knife with careful precision. "She said they were magic, that if you carved them with love, they'd protect the people you cared about." Margaret Howell, her own bonds cut and her dignity restored, watched the family scene with the satisfaction of someone who'd witnessed justice triumph over cruelty. "That boy's got the look of both his parents," she observed to Reverend Morrison, Sarah's stubbornness and Caleb's steady hands. "He's going to be something special." The territorial marshal finished taking statements and approached the small group with the weary satisfaction of a man who'd seen too many cases of domestic tyranny, but was always grateful when justice could still be served. "Mr. Stone, Miss Henley," he said formally, We'll need you both to testify when this comes to trial, but I don't anticipate any problems with the case. Too many witnesses, too much evidence of long-term abuse. Sarah's hand found Caleb's, their fingers intertwining with the desperate intensity of people who'd almost lost each other forever. "What about Tommy?" she asked. "Legally, Robert is still his stepfather. Could he try to claim custody rights?" The marshal's smile was reassuring. "Given the charges we're filing, kidnapping, assault, terroristic threatening, and corruption of a peace officer, I doubt Mr. Henley will be in a position to claim custody of anything for a very long time. The territorial court tends to look unfavorably on men who threaten children with hanging ropes." Tommy looked up from his carving, his green eyes bright with curiosity. "Does this mean I don't have to call him Mr. Robert anymore? Can I just call Caleb Papa like I want?" The question hung in the mountain air like morning mist, carrying with it all the hope and fear of a family trying to rebuild itself from the wreckage of 20 years of separation. Caleb knelt beside his son, his weathered hands covering the boy's smaller ones as they held the carved rabbit together. "You can call me whatever feels right in your heart," Caleb said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I'd be honored if you wanted to call me Papa. I've been waiting 6 years to hear that word from you." Tommy's smile was radiant as summer sunrise, transforming his face with the pure joy that only children can feel when their deepest wishes come true. "Papa," he said, testing the word like a new tool, finding it fit perfectly in his mouth. "Papa, will you teach me to carve horses next? Mama says you made her a whole herd once, so beautiful they looked like they could run right off the shelf." The carved rabbit sat forgotten in Tommy's lap as he threw his arms around Caleb's neck. 20 years of longing and 6 years of dreams, finally coming together in the embrace of father and son. The foundation stones of their new cabin were laid with the same careful precision that had guided Caleb's hands through 20 years of solitary construction, but now each rock carried the weight of shared dreams rather than lonely necessity. Tommy scrambled over the granite blocks like a mountain goat, his young energy infectious as he helped by carrying pebbles and asking endless questions about the building process. Sarah stood in what would become their kitchen, her hands sketching invisible counters and cupboards in the air, while her mind planned meals for a family that would finally eat together every night. The space felt different from Caleb's bachelor cabin, larger, brighter, designed for conversation and laughter rather than mere survival. "The bedroom should face east," she said, her voice carrying the authority of a woman who'd spent 20 years dreaming of the home she'd create if given the chance. "I want to wake up to sunrise coming through clean windows, want to see the mountains painted gold every morning for the rest of my life." Caleb paused in his work, mortar-covered hands resting on stone as he watched his son and the woman he'd never stopped loving plan their future together. 3 months had passed since Robert's arrest and subsequent sentencing to 20 years in the territorial prison, 3 months of slow healing and careful reconstruction of hearts that had been broken for too long. The valley had embraced their unconventional family with surprising warmth, perhaps because everyone understood that true love was rare enough to be treasured regardless of the complications surrounding it. Margaret Howell had become Tommy's unofficial grandmother, teaching him to bake bread and count vegetables with the patience of someone who'd waited her whole life for a child to spoil. "Papa, why do you put the stones so close together?" Tommy asked, his small finger tracing the tight joints between gratining blocks. "Wouldn't it be faster to leave bigger spaces?" Caleb smiled at the question, remembering his own father teaching him the same lessons decades ago. "Because gaps let the weather in, wind, rain, cold. They'll find every weakness and make it bigger over time. But if you fit the stones tight and true, your foundation will stand for 100 years. The metaphor wasn't lost on Sarah, who heard in those words the philosophy that would guide their rebuilt life together. No gaps for doubt to creep in, no spaces where old hurts could fester and grow. They were building more than a house. They were constructing a fortress against the kind of misunderstanding that had separated them before. Work progressed steadily through the summer months, with neighbors arriving most weekends to help with the heavy lifting and complicated carpentry. The barn raising became a community celebration, with tables groaning under potluck contributions and children playing games that echoed across the valley like music. Tommy thrived in this environment of shared purpose and unconditional acceptance, his natural shyness melting away as he discovered what it meant to belong somewhere without fears. His carving skills improved daily under Caleb's patient guidance, creating a menagerie of wooden creatures that soon populated every windowsill and shelf in their temporary quarters. "Look, Mama," he called one evening, holding up a carved bird that seemed ready to take flight. "Papa says this is a meadowlark, like the ones that sing in the morning. He's teaching me to listen to their songs and put the music into the wood." Sarah accepted the gift with the reverence it deserved, turning the small sculpture in her hands and marveling at the detail her 6-year-old son had managed to capture. The bird's head was tilted as if listening, its beak slightly parted in eternal song, its wings positioned for the next beat that would carry it skyward. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," she said, kissing Tommy's forehead before placing the carved meadowlark on the mantelpiece where it would catch the firelight. "Your papa's right about the music. I can almost hear this little fellow sing." As autumn approached and the cabin neared completion, Caleb found himself working longer into the evenings, driven by an urgency he couldn't quite name. Perhaps it was the need to provide shelter before winter, or perhaps it was something deeper, the desire to prove that this time their love would have a solid foundation that no amount of external pressure could shake. The roof beams went up in October, their straight lines reaching toward heaven like prayers made manifest in timber and faith. Standing beneath them, surrounded by his family and the friends who'd helped make their dream reality, Caleb felt something he'd almost forgotten, the deep satisfaction that came from building something meant to last forever. The family portrait captured them in a moment of perfect harmony, their faces glowing with the contentment that comes from love hard-won and carefully preserved. Tommy stood between his parents, with his hand resting on his father's shoulder, his green eyes bright with the confidence of a child who'd never again doubt his place in the world. Sarah's wedding dress, simple white cotton sewn by her own hands, seemed to shimmer with inner light as she smiled at the camera with joy that 20 years of waiting had only made more precious. The photographer, a traveling man from Denver who had heard about the mountain wedding that had become the valley's most celebrated love story, worked with the reverent precision of someone documenting a miracle. Behind them, the peaks stretched toward heaven like cathedral spires, their snow-capped summits blessing this union with the permanence of stone and sky. "Hold still just a moment longer," the photographer called, his head disappearing beneath the black cloth that would capture this instant for future generations to marvel at. "I want to make sure we get every detail perfect." Caleb's arm tightened around Sarah's waist, still amazed by the simple pleasure of being able to touch her freely, publicly, without shame or fear. The gold band on her finger caught the mountain sunlight, but it was her smile that truly blazed with reflected radiance. This ring had been placed there with love rather than purchase, blessed by community joy rather than financial obligation. The ceremony had taken place in Miller's Grove, beside the oak tree where Caleb had once hung a rope swing for a laughing girl who'd grown into a woman worth waiting 20 years to marry. Reverend Morrison had performed the service with tears streaming down his weathered cheeks, his voice breaking with emotion as he pronounced them husband and wife in the sight of God and the assembled witnesses who'd watched their love story unfold. Tommy had served as ring-bearer with the solemn dignity of someone who understood he was participating in the healing of his family's heart. When the Reverend asked who gave this woman to be married, the boy had spoken up in his clear young voice. "She gives herself because that's what love means, and I give my papa permission to marry my mama because they belong together." The laughter and tears that followed had washed away any remaining shadows from the past, leaving only the bright promise of days stretching ahead like an uncharted trail through paradise. "Perfect," the photographer announced, emerging from beneath his cloth with the satisfied expression of someone who'd captured lightning in a bottle. That's going to be a portrait your grandchildren will treasure. As the formal ceremony of picture-taking concluded, the celebration continued with music and dancing that echoed across the valley until the stars emerged to add their blessing to the festivities. Margaret Howell played her accordion with the enthusiasm of someone half her age, while children chased fireflies and adults shared stories that would become part of the community's folklore. Later, as the guests gradually departed and quiet settled over the mountain like a comfortable blanket, the new family sat on their porch, watching the moon rise over the peaks they'd claimed as their eternal home. Tommy had fallen asleep in Sarah's lap, exhausted by excitement and secure in the knowledge that tomorrow would bring more of the same happiness. "Do you think we would have found our way back to each other if Tommy hadn't gotten lost that morning?" Sarah asked, her voice soft with wonder at the chain of events that had brought them to this moment. Caleb considered the question while his hand traced patterns in her hair, marveling at the silver threads that only made her more beautiful. "I think love like ours doesn't give up easily," he said finally. "Maybe it would have taken longer. Maybe the path would have been different, but I believe we were always meant to end up here." Tommy stirred in his sleep, murmuring words that made both parents lean closer to listen. "Papa's home," he whispered, his small face peaceful with absolute trust. "Papa's home, and we're safe forever." The boy's unconscious declaration seemed to rise into the mountain air like incense, carrying their gratitude to whatever forces had conspired to reunite what should never have been separated. Above them, the same stars that had witnessed their first kiss 20 years ago now blessed their second beginning, their light eternal as the love that had survived everything the world could throw against it. In the distance, a meadowlark began its evening song, its melody weaving through the darkness like a benediction. The music seemed to promise that some stories, the ones written by hearts willing to wait and sacrifice and believe, truly do end with words as simple and powerful as these. They lived happily ever after, and their love made the whole valley more beautiful for having witnessed it.